Richard arrived at his friend's wedding straight from the snowy forests of Maine. The man didn't fly to Chicago alone, but with his 6-year-old son, Kevin. Before heading to the restaurant where the celebration was taking place, Richard stopped by the city cemetery. Having laid flowers at the grave of his late wife, he paid tribute to her memory and, holding his son by the hand, walked downtown. Richard hadn't been in the city for about 6 years and had forgotten the area a little. Oliver met them halfway over and took them straight to the restaurant. "I'm so glad to see you, buddy. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be alive today," Oliver said, hugging the guest. Richard smiled and took his son's hand. The boy was overwhelmed with emotions and the fact that he had been on a plane for the first time in his life. "So, what do you say, Kevin? Shall we go to the wedding?" Richard asked with a smile. "Of course, Dad," the boy exclaimed joyfully and ran to the car parked a little further away. On their way to the restaurant, Oliver shared the latest news with his friend and didn't hesitate to express his gratitude for the fact that he managed to find time to attend his wedding. The young businessman knew that Richard was considered one of the best rangers in the forestry. Actually, it was in the forest that he met Oliver. Lulled by the rhythmic noise of the car engine, Richard relaxed and, without even realizing it, plunged into memories. And he had many things to remember. A year ago, Oliver arrived in the Maine forest as part of a tour group to ski and hunt. Everything went well at first. Enjoying the long-awaited vacation, the young businessman especially liked taking long walks in the snowy forest. That was until Oliver decided to go into the forest on his own. The man wanted to test his strength and orienteering skills in an unfamiliar area. Unfortunately, his excessive self-confidence played a cruel joke on Oliver, and after several hours of wandering through the forest thickets, he realized that he was hopelessly lost. Trying to find the right path, the man completely lost his way and wandered off into remote areas, which have long been considered the hunting grounds of wolves. The businessman didn't have any weapon on him, apart from a small tourist hatchet, so when a pack of hungry wolves got on the man's trail, he didn't have anything to defend himself with. Surrounding Oliver from all sides, the predators started closing in on him. The situation was becoming critical, and there was simply no one to come to Oliver's aid. And when the man thought that he was already done for, he heard a rifle shot, which instantly scared the wolves, who had gotten very excited by the sight of easy prey. The first shot was followed by the second and the third. That was enough for the wolves to abandon the prey and rush off. Trembling from the cold and fear, Oliver pressed his back against a tree and tightened his grip on the hatchet. The man didn't know what was happening and thus couldn't figure out whether he could be relieved or terrified. Soon he heard a crackling sound coming from the bushes and saw a man dressed in a camouflage uniform step out onto the path. It was Richard. He accidentally stumbled upon the footprints that Oliver had left in the deep snow. The chaotic trail made Oliver realize that the man was lost and probably wouldn't be able to get out on the forest on his own. And when Richard heard the characteristic wolf howl, he knew that he was right in his assumptions and picked up the pace. Fortunately, the young ranger made it in time, and Oliver escaped the wolves with only a slight fright. At that moment, Richard didn't know that the man he had saved was the owner of one of the leading companies on the market, selling computer equipment throughout the country. Of course, the first thing Oliver did was offer the ranger a generous reward for his rescue. But Richard just smiled and shook his head. "Thanks, I don't need anything." Nevertheless, Oliver gave the ranger a brand new snowmobile and hiking supplies to use on his rounds of the forest. Meanwhile, the young businessman was very surprised to learn that Richard lived alone with his 5-year-old son. The ranger didn't say anything about his wife, except that she died in a car crash several years ago. After that incident, Richard and Oliver became good friends. Even when the businessman returned to his hometown, they stayed in touch and often talked on the phone about all kinds of things. And 6 months ago, Oliver told his friend that he was in love with a wealthy woman. Having heard that Oliver's girlfriend came from a wealthy family, Richard grimaced, as if from a toothache. For the young ranger, this was an extremely painful topic, mostly due to problems he had to face in his past. Richard's late wife, just like Oliver's girlfriend, grew up in a wealthy family and was used to living in luxury and prosperity. At that moment, his friend's voice pulled the ranger out of his painful memories. "Well, here we are. I'll leave you two for a little bit. I need to clean up. And you and Kevin go inside and find a free table." "Wow, what a beautiful building!" Kevin exclaimed happily, looking out the window. The boy spent most of his life in a small house near the forest and had never been to a restaurant before, especially not such an expensive one. Nodding to his friend, Richard and his son stepped out of the car and headed for the entrance, where the guests were already gathering. Chatting and laughing merrily, they didn't pay any attention to a tall, thin man in a cheap suit, holding the hand of a 7-year-old boy. Once in the lobby of the restaurant, Richard felt rather uncomfortable. There was loud music playing, which literally stunned the ranger, accustomed to the silence of the wilderness. And only little Kevin liked everything that was happening around him. The tables in the restaurant were bursting with the wide variety of dishes and drinks, which looked delicious and whetted everyone's appetite. The waiters were circulating among the guests with trays full of drinks so that the guests could toast the newlyweds. Choosing a table in the corner, Richard first helped Kevin sit down and then sat down himself. Seeing that no one cared about his presence, the ranger relaxed visibly and looked at the stage, where the newlyweds were supposed to appear at any minute. They had to wait for at least half an hour, and most of the guests were getting rather frustrated. Finally, the restaurant got quiet, and Oliver stepped onto the stage. He was smiling radiantly at the photographers and holding the hand of his beautiful young bride. Trying to get a better look at the newlyweds, Richard got up from the table and took a few steps towards the stage. At some point, the bride's face got into the spotlight. It seemed vaguely familiar to Richard. Unwilling to believe his eyes, the young ranger stepped closer and was literally stunned by what he saw. "April? Is that really you? God, this can't be happening," Richard whispered. The man kept staring at the bride without even blinking. The woman was a spitting image of his wife who had died in a car accident. Still in a state of deep shock, Richard didn't even notice that his son was standing nearby and looking at his father's face, which had tears flowing down his cheeks. "Dad, why are you crying? Do you know this woman?" Kevin asked cautiously. Richard shuddered and looked at his son with eyes full of tears. It took the ranger great strength to pull himself together and tell his son the truth. "This woman is your mother, Kevin," Richard said quietly. "What do you mean, my mother? Didn't you tell me that she was dead?" the boy exclaimed in surprise. Unfortunately, Richard was unable to provide his son with an adequate answer to his question. Richard's mind went dizzy. His thoughts went back 7 years, when he was still living in Chicago and wasn't even thinking about becoming a forest ranger. He worked as a mechanic in a car shop back then and was happy with the life he had. One day, Richard met a woman named April Lang at one of the student parties. The woman grew up in a wealthy family and talked to the young auto mechanic. She repeatedly emphasized that she belonged to the financial elite of the city. Richard wasn't interested in the woman's finances. The most important thing for him was the mutual attraction that flared up between them from the very first minutes of their conversation. The young people started dating right after their first meeting. Despite the disapproval of April's parents, the young people's relationship developed rather quickly, and 3 months later, they became an official couple. "Honey, what do you want with this poor auto mechanic? Aren't there any other young men you could date? Someone from a wealthy family?" Ronald Lang said. "Dad, don't be a hypocrite. I love Richard and we intend to get married," April answered as if it was nothing special. But convincing the influential oil man turned out to be rather difficult. Ronald was ready to get rid of Richard in the truest sense of the word, and then it turned out that his daughter was pregnant. Since she was already too far along, it was too late to terminate, and the businessman had no choice but to come to terms with the situation. Realizing that they would soon become parents, Richard and April got married and started living together. And 6 months later, little Kevin was born. He made his father the happiest man in the world. Unfortunately, after the birth of her son, April fell into a terrible depression and didn't want to have anything to do with him. "Honey, but you can't just abandon Kevin. He's your son," Richard said, trying to help his wife. But no matter how much the man tried to awaken April's maternal instincts, it didn't seem to help the least bit. But that wasn't the only thing that worried Richard. Ronald Lang flat out refused to accept his grandson and treated him like a stranger. Of course, such an attitude couldn't help strengthen the marriage of Richard and April, which seemed to be falling apart as it was. Eventually, it all ended in a painful divorce over some far-fetched reason, which, no surprise there, put Richard in an unpleasant light. Since April didn't want to make time for her 1-year-old son, Richard got custody of Kevin. Looking for a way to start a new life, the man moved to Maine and joined the forestry as a ranger. Nevertheless, he called April every once in a while to tell her about Kevin and his achievements. That was until one day, Ronald Lang picked up the phone and informed Richard that April had died in a car accident. The single father had to go through a lot before he finally pulled himself together and let go of the pain and disappointment. Having become a ranger, Richard found his calling in protecting the inhabitants of the forest and the environment. The young ranger couldn't have known that by protecting Oliver from the pack of hungry wolves, he was actually saving his ex-wife's fiancé, whom he thought was dead all that time. Wanting to find out the truth once and for all, Richard came close to the stage and looked into the bride's eyes. April shuddered, turned pale, and took a few steps back. Of course, the woman recognized her ex-husband and realized that it was her own son who was standing next to him. Tears of belated remorse welled up in the woman's eyes, which didn't really help justify her in Richard's eyes. I can't explain. You have to understand." April started, stammering at every word. But Richard already figured out that his ex-wife's death was just a lie her father used to get Richard out of their lives forever. Ronald Lang always disliked his son-in-law and always wanted to get rid of him. It was his idea to tell Richard that April had died in a car crash. The most interesting thing was that the rich man took it as far as to organize a fake funeral, burying an empty coffin. Having broken ties with his loser son-in-law, Ronald did everything to ensure that his daughter forgot all about her past and began a new life. And now, looking into each other's eyes, Richard and April no longer saw the warmth they had once felt for each other. Puzzled by his wife's behavior, Oliver stood in the middle of the stage and didn't know what to do. Although he didn't know all the details, he already managed to figure out that April and Richard knew each other. Unwilling to waste his time on empty talk, the young ranger took his son's hand and headed for the exit. Richard knew that he would return to Maine and make sure that he would never have to see April again, after what she did to him and their son. Of course, April made an attempt to catch up with Richard and ask for forgiveness. But the young ranger didn't hold a grudge against her. 6 years had passed since their separation, and there was no pity for his ex-wife left in the man's soul. Having returned to Maine with his son, Richard met a nice woman who worked as a vet and started a new life with her, in which there was no more lies or misunderstandings. Nevertheless, he still remained friends with Oliver, who divorced April immediately after the wedding. Feeling hopeful about his future, the young ranger was sure that he'd live his life with dignity, being a loving father and a true friend to his son.